Peter Svidler qualified to participate in the candidate cycle by placing second in the World Cup, which just finished up in Russia. And with that, he joins Vishwanathan Anand, Fabiano Caruana, Hikaru Nakamura, and the winner of that World Cup, Sergei Karjakin, in the candidates tournament to be contested next March. You all know who we are. We don't need to go through that. So 3 weeks ago, I boldly predicted that when we were here for the Nakamura lecture, I said Karjakin had the better head-to-head record against Svidler, and I predicted that he was going to win. And then after the first two games of this match, I was getting ready to eat my foot because it was a pretty sloppy final, but Svidler won the first two games. All he had to do was hold a draw in Game 3 or in Game 4, and he would win the World Cup and 120,000 euros, I believe. I'm not sure if it's dollars or euros, and then obviously make it into the candidate cycle. Well, he didn't. He lost Game 3. He lost Game 4, or you could say Karjakin won Game 3 and Game 4, although in Game 3 he had this position where if he just would have made this one queen move, he would have, Karjakin probably would have resigned on the spot because it was an obvious win, and then didn't. And he was very upset with himself. He kind of stormed around the stage, but went to a playoff, and Karjakin ended up winning that series of rapid and blitz games. And so with that, Karjakin wins first place and also a berth in the candidate cycle. But it's not that big of a deal. Really, the prize was getting into the candidates tournament. That's what Svidler wanted the most, and presumably what Karjakin wanted as well. Wasn't the finest chess, but both players were pretty tired after a very grueling 2 weeks of knockout competition. So rating-wise, I often give you a rating update. In the last 3 weeks, not much has changed. Topalov is pretty much a shoo-in. There's no doubt he could drop 100 rating points, and I think he would still get in. And that's not going to happen. So Topalov looks like a shoo-in for the candidate cycle, and it also looks like Anish Giri is going to get in as well. His rating has actually gone up. He's ranked number 4 in the world right now. And it doesn't look like anybody's going to dethrone him. Leveronian is really making a push. He did very well in Sinquefield. He did very well in the World Cup. And his rating has gone up, but it's not, nearly enough to overtake Anish Giri. So it looks like the field is set, but we don't know who's going to be the organizer's pick. Now, but let's look at Peter Svidler. Peter Svidler was born in St. Petersburg, Russia, where he still lives. He was born in 1976, so it makes him 39 years old now. And he speaks, obviously his first language is Russian, but he speaks English very, very fluently, pretty much as well as we do. And he's known for his English commentary. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. And he is known as a charismatic, nice guy on the tour. He's held in very good esteem by his contemporaries. The media likes him a lot. He was the organizer's nominee for the 2014 candidate cycle. When Russia hosted it, they used their wild card to get Peter Svidler into the candidates tournament. Not surprising given the quality of his chess, and also not surprising given the fan base that he has for various reasons, which we'll get into. So Svidler grew up in St. Petersburg, and he played, at the age of 6, he learned how to play chess. His mother and father both supported him in that endeavor. His mother was a classically trained musician. This sounds like Nakamura last month, I know. And he played his chess at the Young Pioneers Palace, which is currently called the Anchikov Palace in St. Petersburg, but it was called during the times of the USSR, the Young Pioneers Palace. And that's an aerial shot of the Young Pioneers Palace. It looks pretty nice. That was a building devoted to extracurricular activities. It was kind of like the equivalent of the Boy Scouts in the United States. And I've mentioned the Young Pioneers Palace a gajillion times, but I'm going to reiterate it. This is the exact same building where Viktor Korchnoi learned his ability, where he developed his ability at chess. It's the same building that Boris Spassky learned to play chess. It's the same building where Peter Svidler and basically every chess great to grow up in St. Petersburg learned to play chess at the Young Pioneers Palace, and it produced a number of very, very, very strong players. The coaches there were among the finest in Russia. They had very strict training regimens. They had a strong focus on developing talent, and it was all free. Now, after the fall of the USSR, these facilities were no longer free. Some of them remained pioneers' palaces or community centers. Some became casinos. Some became strip clubs. In St. Petersburg, it is now a palace. It's kind of a tourist place. So the system that cultivated some of the finest Soviet players and Russian players to enter into chess doesn't really exist in the same form anymore. We are not in the era of Mikhail Botvinnik any longer. But this is where Svidler honed his skills at chess. So he showed promise from a pretty early age. By the time he was 16, he won the USSR Junior Championship, and he earned his IM title. By the time he was 17, he won the World Under-18 Youth Chess Championship. By the time he was 18, he was the champion of the USSR, or Russia, I should say. This was after the fall of the USSR. And I should say Russia afterward. This is a mistake on my part. But he was champion at 18, then again at 19, then again at 21. And Svidler, as we'll see later, went on to win the Championship of Russia many times, more than any other player in the history of the Soviet Union or Russia. More than Mikhail Botvinnik, more than Smyslov, more than Yezmetinov, more than any Soviet great you can think of. He won the title far more than any of them. He's won it now 7 times. Second place, more than Kasparov, more than Karpov. The second place is Yezmetinov at 5, and nobody else is even close. I don't know that anybody will ever surpass Peter Svidler for his numbers of championships of Russia, and that gives him some serious chess cred. So he was grandmaster at 18. He realized that he wanted to be a professional chess player fairly early in life. His parents supported him. They helped him obtain books, and he read this How to Beat Bobby Fischer, the Russian translation of it. He said he read it cover to cover so many times that it fell apart. And he read a couple of other books which were really influential on his chess development. He read My System by Nimzovich. This is not surprising. Although he says now it's kind of, out of fashion somewhat. He read it a lot. And then the other book that he read a lot when he was a child that influenced him greatly was Zurich 1953, which Warren cited a couple times as one of his, if not his favorite book for chess. But he talks about how much that book influenced him as well. He grew up looking at chess players like Bobby Fischer and Garry Kasparov and thinking that they were great players worthy of imitation. But his favorite, his absolute hero, is Tal. Not surprising, he's inspired many a chess player. Okay, so let's look at our first couple of games tonight. We're going to go over 5 games tonight. And fittingly, the first game we're going to look at is Svidler versus Kasparov. Kasparov being the absolute strongest player in Russia and the entire world at this time. This was in Tilburg, 1997, arguably when Kasparov's in his strongest period his strongest peak. And then later we'll look at Topalov, who was also world champion around the time that he played Svidler, and see how Svidler fares as a fairly young player in 97 as a more seasoned player in 2006. And as always, to run through those games, I will turn it over to Warren.
So he was still pretty young in 97. He had, I don't know if he'd already won the Russia Championship that year before this tournament or not. I didn't look at the time periods. But he'd already won it once in 96, 95 before that.
He won it in 97, 94, 95, 97.
Okay, yeah. So he'd already won the Russia Championship twice. But this was really when he became a respected chess player. I mean, beating Kasparov, that's a very short list. That's, as much as Lucas talked about how impressive it is to win the Russian championship, beating Kasparov, I think, is even more impressive. I mean, that's going to be up there on chess player accomplishments, so let me tell you. Okay, yeah, so, in this game, Svidler kind of beat Kasparov at his own game. Svidler thrived in dynamic positions. He likes fluid situations where he has lots of piece activity. And you'll see that in this Kasparov game. So let's take a look. So I actually like what Svidler did with the opening. So during this period in his career, Kasparov was just killing people left and right with a Najdorf. And Kasparov was also just coming off of his World Championship match with Anand, where he crushed him with the Dragon. So I think Svidler wisely did not play into an open Sicilian. I think this was a good choice already. So C3 may look kind of funky. It's basically a delayed Alapin, right? The way you normally get into the Alapin is with C3 on move 2. But having played Knight F3 and D6 included, it's somewhat interesting for white. D6 isn't necessarily that great of a move for black in the Alapin. So it's an interesting opening. And coincidentally, if you look up Kasparov's simul games in your free time, you'll see that he loved to play this delayed Alapin in his simuls. He played it in many games with white and has a lot of nice victories. So already it looks like white has a problem to solve because e4 is being attacked. But it's not actually being attacked because of this check on a4. Hence, use Svidler's bishop e2. So the pawn can't really be taken. But after knight d7, now it's a real threat to white. So d3, right? Now, by the way, queen c2 may look like a more natural way of defending the pawn because one of the main ideas of the Alapin is to play d4, right? But black can play the sneaky move queen c7 to stop d4. Because now if we play d4, we can't take and maintain our pretty pawn center. So just an opening subtlety to keep in mind.
You can't take with the knight either.
Well, you could, but then it kind of defeats the purpose of white's opening, right? Because now your c3 pawn is blocking the way for your knight. Yeah, basically, if you can't achieve d4 in this opening, then you're going to look kind of silly because then why'd you play c3, right? Okay. So now d3. So white will like to play d4, but for now we maintain our patience. And now he plays d4 right away without preparation. Normally, you might see something like rook e1, bishop f1, and only then playing d4. But he offers a very dangerous pawn sacrifice. And, Kasparov just went for it. So he first took, and then took on e4. Now, I think if you ask Kasparov again, he'd probably just play bishop g7 and get developed. This was probably the right decision. If you look at this, the computer, it'll say, bishop g7 and knight takes pawn are about, both give white a small plus. But, I'd much rather play a position with a small white plus where white doesn't have huge compensation. Right? So, but he went for it. And white doesn't have anything winning or particularly clear. It's just a somewhat dangerous position for black. And now knight g5. This is already kind of an awkward position for black because black squares are really weak here. I played d5. It may look more natural to preserve the bishop, say with like bishop d7, but then white can get a strong attack with bishop c4. The problem is that if you play e6, white can just sack, and it's a very dangerous attack for white. So this would not be what black wants. Yeah, it's very scary. And the other problem for black is that if you play d5 to block that attack in f7, white can just play queen f3. And this attacks f7 and the d5 pawn. And knight f6 doesn't help us. Because blocking that check is not easy to do without getting mated. So unfortunately, black would have some difficulties there. So as much as black would like to keep that bishop, it's not easy. So that's why he has to play this really awkward looking move d5. Now bishop b5. This threatens the simple just knight takes and then bishop c6 with the fork. So it just threatens win a pawn. Bishop g7. But f3. Svidler is looking for more than that. Now the bishop doesn't have many squares. If bishop e6, it's a very painful position. White can just take, play rook e1. So instead he counterattacked with h6. And now Svidler can get the 2 bishops. And cause black's king some angst as well. So, in this position, although objectively black's not much worse, it's really hard to play black's position because of this wandering king on the king side, and white does have the 2 bishops in an open position. So this is defensible, but it's not easy to play. Even Kasparov couldn't find the right path here. And yeah, already the computer would like for black to play g4 and not lose that pawn and get rid of that weakness. And it's starting to become a difficult position because it's not easy to save this pawn. And yeah, knight h5 was a blunder as well because this rook was just trapped. It turns out black can't win back the exchange because if you take the rook, just queen takes. So that doesn't help black. And unfortunately, black doesn't have enough compensation for the exchange. This isn't too difficult to win.
So it was all in the opening, wasn't it?
Yeah, it basically went out of the opening.
Yeah.
And that's hard to do against Kasparov.
Yeah, and then Kasparov just resigned. His pin on the e-file is mortal. But yeah, he basically Kasparov. He got Kasparov in a dangerous position from the opening, sacrificed the pawn, and Kasparov took it, and his king got out in the open and didn't really handle it correctly, and Svidler punished him. I mean, this was really where Svidler shines, you know, in these open, dynamic positions. He plays really good chess.
Can you see the opening again?
Yeah. Going back to the opening, it's pretty cool.
Yeah.
It's not crushing, you know. Like I said, if Kasparov could do this again, I don't think he would take that pawn. It just really accelerated white's development. I think he thought young Svidler was just, you know, I mean, by the time Kasparov played him, this was the first time they'd met, by the way. Kasparov was well aware of him, and he knew that Svidler was a sharp player, but I think he thought he was overstepping his bounds, probably. So that's one of the points of white's opening here.
That's why black plays 97 to block that.
Yeah, now there's a real threat to this pawn.
That's interesting. It's good to know that after move 8, that even Kasparov can make a blunder. That's good.
Yeah.
Means hope for us.
Yeah, I'm not sure, you know,
It's not a blunder, but I don't know.
Yeah, the computer says equal, but
yeah, it's he can take the pawn, but he has to be a lot more precise than white. Like one thing you'll notice if you analyze the game, like even, you know, after move 20 or so, black it was like a plus equal position, but it was foldable. But if you look at the number of moves that are good for black, it's like he has one okay move, and then it's like plus minus, plus minus, plus minus, you know.
His flexibility is greatly decreased.
Right. And you look at white's choices, it's like he has 5 moves that are all good. You know, it's, when you see that kind of evaluation, you know you're headed down the wrong path.
So Warren, this is the crucial
That's
move
interesting.
that he moved, right?
And yeah,
D4.
by the way, c takes d4 is a good idea for black in these positions, and I'll mention why.
because you want your rook to c8, right?
Yeah, so black can utilize the c file, whereas white can't really.
Yeah.
Now, black should refrain from taking on d4 if the white knight could go to c3, but since the knight's already committed to d2, it's not a problem. So in this particular case, it's okay doing that. But yeah, in retrospect, I think Kasparov would just play bishop g7. It's way simpler.
Although you give white a strong pawn center there.
Yeah.
You could look to undermine it later, but
Yeah,
that's
white-
the problem
white-
with Alapin is you get
Yeah.
a strong pawn center.
Yeah, white does have a good pawn center, although black has no real weaknesses, and yeah, it's probably a slight plus equal.
Was this
No.
was that the real time, by the way?
No, the clock is off, I should mention.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And then also you mentioned, and this is that was a good point, was that the flexibility of moves are cut down to. Is there a tool that actually gauges that other than, I mean, that's out there that's good for that type of thing? That can show,
I don't know actually.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know if they've advanced engines to take into account, you know, the number of good moves into the evaluation. I don't know if you really can or should in a way, right? Because if you have a move that's checkmate in 1, then all the other moves lose. I mean, isn't your position still pretty good? You know. So I don't know if they can really realistically put that measurement into computer evaluations.
Yeah, the computer doesn't care because it'll find the.
Well, no, that's what I'm saying. The computer will always find the exact thread that needs to actually happen, that the right sequence.
It doesn't matter if it's only moved for 10 straight moves, the computer will see that.
But it would be interesting to know if there's something that could say, well, look, this position lends itself to much more open flexibility that you could have as opposed to something that you have to play very precise down the road.
And that's something that Carlsen's very good at, by the way. People, talk about his ability in the endgame. He's very good at getting into positions where he has lots of good moves and his opponents just don't, even if the position's equal.
Right.
He has an amazing intuition about what those positions are.
So how to set problems for his opponents.
Yeah, exactly. Carlsen is just excellent at giving opponents problems. Even if he's not winning, he's very good at that. But yeah, and just to make a point on the C-pawn part. So if we look at the French advance, for example, so that point about the knight going to C3, that's exactly why taking on D4 is not at all popular in the French advance here. Even though it might seem logical because the base of the pawn chain, becomes weaker on D4 as opposed to B2, right? But giving white this extra square for the knight is not something black wants to do because, as is, it's not easy for white to develop the knight actively. So that's, an example of position where taking on D4 is not a good idea. As opposed to that last position in the Sicilian we were looking at. So if we go back to the game, it was a good idea to take on D4 here because that knight can't get to C3, right? So just a point that'll come up in a lot of different positions.
That's the best pose for that knight, C3.
It's the most active for sure because on D2 it blocks the dark squared bishop and it doesn't control D5 or B5.
And it's also the difference between an open file and a semi-open file.
Right. So any more questions on this game? Yeah. All right, let's also look at his win against Topalov. All right, so
this is an aside. Some people have mentioned when the player plays black to flip the board. I don't know if you have a preference there.
Oh, sure.
I mean, it's your call.
Yeah. I can try flipping it to black's perspective. So you can see the board like Svidler, right? In 2D.
Yeah. Some YouTube comments have asked for that. So
that's not a bad idea.
Okay.
I sometimes do that too, and I'm like, I want to play the winner.
We'll try it and see what the comments are like now. Next time they'll be like, just leave it as, just leave white on the bottom all the time. We'll see.
All right. So in this game, we're going to see Svidler playing his favorite defense, the Grunfeld. And this is really perfectly his style because the Grunfeld leads to very open positions, which, like Lucas and I have pointed out, that's where he thrives. That's what he likes. And he's had a lot of success with it. And, after Fischer and Kasparov, he's really the one that's continued its popularity after them. Nowadays there are other strong players that play it, Caruana, Grischuk, and so on, right? But really, Svidler has contributed a lot to this opening to keep it alive. So let's see what he does with Topalov in this game. So we pretty much enter the big classical main line with bishop c4 and knight e2. The reason the knight goes to e2 is so that bishop g4 won't keep white's knight from defending the center. Knight f3 is a possible move, but this is an important line because if white can just maintain that big center, it can cause black a lot of problems. And of course, playing c5 is a very natural way for black to try to challenge white's big center in these lines, because otherwise you don't want to leave white with a big pawn center with no counterplay. So by the way, I'll mention, in the Grunfeld, you definitely have to be comfortable with letting your opponent have a passed d-pawn. If you're not comfortable, that the Grunfeld is not for you. But black, of course, has a share of counterplay. And this is a very important move for black to control the c4 square. So black can stop this buddy from joining his friend on b5.
Svidler's also said that he thinks that the passed D pawn in the Grunfeld is not a big deal, but that sometimes people evaluate it as this reason to not play the Grunfeld. That he doesn't see it that way at all.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the advantage of Black's position, as opposed to many openings, is that he really doesn't have bad pieces. You know, if you look at the French defense, you have a bad light squared bishop. You know, if you look at the Karjakin, White just has more space. You know, if you look at the Sicilian, you're behind in development. The Grunfeld doesn't really have these problems. The only problem you have is that you give White a big center, but you yourself don't have a lot of weaknesses or bad pieces. So that makes it kind of nice to play. Now, I'd say the only downside of the Grunfeld is that Black's moves are a little bit predictable because you're always going to play bishop g7 and c5 and castle. So that does lend it to White players preparing really deep. Like you'll see preparation against a Grunfeld consistently go out to, you know, the mid-20s, you know, move numbers. So that is the one downside of playing the Grunfeld. But, you know, from that perspective, White also has to prepare as much. So, all right. So White's trying to destroy Black's pawn structure, but Black can do the exact same thing. So now Black intends to take on c4 and then d5, and White's proud center is going to be gone. So White's got to make some threats. Hopefully push the rook off the d file. It does force Svidler to make a somewhat awkward move in doing that. But the bishop on g5 isn't doing anything anymore.
What's wrong with this f6?
Well, f6 doesn't look attractive because now your bishop is blocked. So I think that's why he decided against that.
He's threatening his bishop.
Yeah, but bishop goes to h4 and then neutralizes your bishop.
Yeah, I think he probably would have played here to threaten the pawn, and then, you know, the bishop just looks sad now. So I think Svidler would prefer to have a temporarily passive rook than playing f6. So now White's one step closer to undermining that d-pawn. But White does get it passed.
He does get it passed. I was wondering why he didn't pass it before with the bishop on it. Why did he... Yeah,
right away?
Yeah, why did he do that?
I think e5.
Oh.
And then we can take.
Okay. Yeah.
Yep.
You think, you don't.
Yeah.
Okay. Got it.
But now it's supported by the queen, so we don't lose it, at least right away. So although White has his powerful passed d-pawn, Black has a beautiful pair of bishops. So it turns out it gives Black a good game here. Now I play f6, but we're going to open up the bishop in time right away. So now White has a problem because both e4 and f4 are being threatened. So he's going to lose that center pawn. And now Black's bishops are still really active. Yeah, the rook's under attack by this bishop. And Black's pair of c-pawns are going to end up being stronger than this white d-pawn. And the endgame with the two bishops is just good for Black here. And we'll see Svidler win quite nicely here. And now Svidler finds a nice move. c4. Problem for White is that if you take the pawn, then rook b2, and Black's going to make a queen.
Yeah. Promotion.
So unfortunately, he has to sack the b pawn. But now these c pawns are pretty much impossible to stop. f4 is very nice. If we take, then c3, and then we take the bishop. The bishop has to go back. But now we threaten the queen and the bishop, so White ends up losing a piece. And then, yeah, the rest isn't too important. With the extra piece, it is a technical win.
Can you go back to see how
You mean at earlier than this?
yeah.
So, yeah, the Black strategy kind of started with this b5 move. This is the crucial move to remember in these structures. The c4 square is really important for Black to control in the Grunfeld. Because if you can control that, you can stop White from supporting the d-pawn with the c-pawn.
So sometimes it's not good to have a center.
Yeah, the problem with having a big center is you need to maintain it and defend it.
If you can.
That's what Black's betting for in the Grunfeld, is that White's center will be weak. So this is a really nice game by Svidler, showing how to undermine that white center with b5 and e6, and the passed d-pawn didn't compensate for black's activity. All right. Any questions about this one? All right. Hope you like seeing it from black's perspective this time.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to tell you quite a bit about Svidler's personality because, in my opinion, he is one of the more, perhaps the most interesting player in the top 10, or in the candidate cycle. I don't actually think he's rated in the top 10 right now. I think he's more top 20. But personality-wise, of all the candidates and all the players we've covered, I identify quite a bit with him. We have quite a bit in common. And I think some of you will see some parallels as well to your own personalities, because Svidler is a very outgoing, charismatic person. In fact, he gets along with pretty much everybody. And I told you that with Anand, that Anand was Mr. Nice Guy. He is not polarizing and that everybody tends to get along well with him. Svidler's the same way, but he's also very disarming in his wit and his self-deprecating humor and his very strong sense of irony. You can see that from the Kramnik quote on the bottom left there. But he is very good friends with Vishwanathan Anand. He's very good friends with Vladimir Kramnik. He gets along well with lots of other players. And Sergei Shipov actually attributes this to the fact that maybe Svidler is doing this on purpose to keep his opponents from playing as hard against him. Because if you really dislike someone, you have a strong motivation, to prove them wrong at the chessboard. And, we've seen that with Carlsen and his trash talking. He seems to like to foster a sense of enmity between himself and his rivals. And it seems to fuel him, gives him motivation. And Svidler doesn't have that. He seems like a very down-to-earth, nice guy. In fact, if you look at his interviews on YouTube or his interviews online, he takes the time to answer questions in very great depth and with a frankness and honesty that's pretty rare, particularly among quote-unquote celebrities. He probably wouldn't consider himself that way, but in the chess world, he certainly is. And so he gets along well with the other players, but don't let that fool you. He still had quite a bit of success. This is a list of the winners of the Russian Championship. And I just want to point out, 1994, Peter Svidler, 95, 97, 2003, 2008, 2011, 2013. That's almost a 20-year span where Peter Svidler has won the USSR Championship 7 out of 19 years. And he's done that against some of the best players in the world. You see Karjakin there, you see Yakovenko there, you've seen Tomaszewski, Morozevich, you've seen Kalifman, you've seen all these other players. Gary Kasparov has competed in a couple of them. You've seen all these players who are world-class players. And Svidler has not only triumphed, but he's triumphed many, many times. And, you win once, okay, that can be just because you had a favorable tournament, you were in the right mindset, you had good matches, you had favorable colors against certain players, maybe you had some opening prep that people weren't prepared for. Okay, once you can chalk it up to, I don't want to say luck, but you could chalk it up to a bunch of other factors. 7 times, you've got to establish that that's a pattern, that is really special. And I said before, I don't think that that's going to be surpassed in my lifetime in the next 50 or 60 years. I can't imagine. Maybe there will be a player who is super dominant and who chooses to participate in the Russian championships a lot. I mean, back in the day, Botvinnik, I don't know if he ever participated in a Russian championship. Smyslov, if he did, it wasn't very often. Same with Petrosian and same with some of the other greats. Kasparov and Karpov didn't compete in Russian championships all that often, or USSR championships all that often either. So it would take someone who is dedicated to participating in it a lot, and B, someone who is a very, very, very strong player, as Peter Svidler is. He has also done very well in the World Chess Championships, but he's always fallen a little bit short. So in 2002, you may remember it was a knockout tournament, and he lost to Ponomaryov in the semifinals, and Ponomaryov ended up winning the whole thing. So he was very, very close to, he was essentially in the top 4 along with Vishwanathan Anand, in terms of getting to. He wasn't quite the FIDE World Chess Champion. You remember that Kramnik is the PCA champion at this time. It's still a divided title. 2005, it's still a divided title, and you see that Svidler ties Anand for second, behind Topalov, who wins the FIDE World Chess Championship in 2005. So again, very, very close. 8.5, being 1.5 points. Okay, Topalov was clear first, don't get me wrong, but Svidler and Anand were quite close. Maybe, though, part of the reason Svidler's always come up a little bit short is that Svidler has a lot of other interests. I've mentioned his love of the English language and how adept he is at speaking it. He also happens to be absolutely in love with the quintessential English sport, and that would be cricket. Peter Svidler is probably one of the world's biggest cricket fans. He has described it as an obsession. He was introduced to cricket in 1999 by Nigel Short, and he was corrupted, I guess you can say, or he was indoctrinated, but he certainly became a huge fan of cricket. And he talks about the fact that because of time zone differences, sometimes he's not getting much sleep because he's watching cricket in Australia at 4 o'clock in the morning, when sane people would be sleeping. But he also has chosen tournaments based on where he might get the opportunity to practice some cricket. He has gone to many a cricket game, watched a lot of cricket. There you can see him watching cricket on his computer when he probably should be doing something else. But perhaps the most damning piece of evidence is that in the late 2000s, Peter Svidler was known for his Excel spreadsheets that he used to track cricket statistics and that he used to track rosters. And some people have said that Peter Svidler's knowledge of cricket is greater than, the journalists and commentators who write about cricket for a living, that he is that much of a cricket fanatic that he can name the roster of, Zimbabwe's cricket team, and even, professional commentators would have trouble naming, half the team, but he can name them all. He has a certain, a kind of an encyclopedic knowledge of cricket, and that is detracted from his chess, obviously. If you're spending several hours a day watching cricket and, studying cricket statistics and matches, it could detract from studying for chess. On ICC, his handle is Tendulkar, and if you've ever wondered, he's taken a handle that corresponds to probably the best cricket player of all time. And so his handle is a tribute. And if you were to look up his profile, you would see that he not only has a tribute to Tendulkar, but he has a bunch of kind of weird lines. And if you're wondering, I actually wasn't sure myself, so I Googled them, and it turns out that most of those are song lyrics from Tom Waits or Bob Dylan. So you can see that he is a big fan of music as well, and those are two of his favorite singers. In fact, I saw another interview with him where he's talking about like the top 5 albums of all time, and Tom Waits and Bob Dylan were among those top 5 albums of his of all time. And he talks about the role of music in his life. I mean, his mother was an honored teacher of Russia for music. She was a classically trained musician. He was exposed to music from a young age, but his love really extended not to classical music, but more to folk music and some classic rock as well. Talks about, how fanatic he is about going to see concerts when artists tour, particularly in St. Petersburg. He talks about seeing Bob Dylan in St. Petersburg and how that was basically one of his life's highlights. So he is a cricket fan. He is a music nut. He is also really, really good at billiards. There was a time in the mid to late 2000s where he was spending 4 or 5 hours a day practicing billiards. Playing billiards, some Moscow variation of billiards. I'm not familiar with billiards enough to tell you what that entails, but he can also play pool quite well. And he is a big fan of snooker, that other quintessential English game. And he has stayed up late watching, snooker tournaments, and presumably plays snooker quite well and has several different cues, and a table and plays and still enjoys billiards a lot, and he's dabbled in poker. He has a lot of interests that are outside of chess. And the question is, does this detract from chess? Well, certainly to a certain extent. He reads a lot. You often see him even at tournaments, like when he's not playing, he'll be in the stands, and instead of watching a match, he'll be reading a book. Or at award ceremonies, he'll be reading a book. So he's an avid reader. Somebody asked him, do you play computer games? And he says, no, because I would love it too much, and then, that would distract me, and I'm already very good at avoiding what I should be doing. Why add something else to that? Mm-hmm. So Svidler's very known for his other interests, and I think we can all identify with that to a certain extent. There are some people who are very single-minded about chess. Caruana comes to mind. Caruana has an insane work ethic when it comes to chess. Svidler, not so much. He is kind of maybe a modern-day Capablanca, in the sense that, you remember in my Capablanca lecture, I said that Capablanca didn't even have a board at home, and he didn't really play chess much outside of tournaments. I'm not saying Svidler is the same. I'm sure he works a lot harder than Capablanca. You have to in this era to stay sharp. But he certainly had periods of time where he has been distracted and hasn't been in the strongest of chess shape. 2014, 2015, he showed us in the World Cup that he's playing very good chess right now. So it'll be interesting to see how much motivation he has going into the Candidates tournament. I think it'll actually be quite a bit, because he is, I think that the Candidates tournament is one of his favorite tournaments that exists, and I think he really steps it up. We also know Peter Svidler from his postmortems. That tradition in chess where after you play a game, you and sometimes your opponent sit down at the broadcast booth and you go over it. And you talk about variations, you maybe look at some computer analysis, and you reveal your thinking. And Svidler, to my mind, is the best chess commentator in the English language, perhaps in any language. His commentary is fascinating. Number one, you have a very articulate speaker. Number two, you have someone very witty who thinks very quickly on their feet. And number three, you have one of the world's strongest players. It just makes for a great combination in a chess commentator. His postmortems, particularly when he and Kramnik play and they sit down and discuss afterward, those are some of the most fascinating moments to me in anything that you see in chess. And so if you ever have the opportunity to see Svidler commentate, and unfortunately sometimes he's playing in the tournaments instead of commentating, so it's kind of, we win one way because we get to see his chess and we lose another way because we miss his commentary. I would highly encourage you to watch his postmortems. He has a very, very keen mind, and his style and delivery is very fluid. For someone speaking their second language, I'm absolutely floored by his ability and his articulacy in English. We're going to move on to some of his other accomplishments later, more recent results. But before we do that, let's look at two other games from Svidler. One against Karjakin, one against Nakamura, played 4 or 5 years ago. And I put this quote at the bottom. This is something Svidler said about openings. And he talks about the fact that, openings are not everything, but you need to have a very solid understanding of openings. We've established, or Warren established in Game 2, that Svidler is one of the world's foremost authorities on the Grunfeld. And we have what I think is the absolute pleasure of seeing that another time, or to see Svidler once or twice more in the opening that he is known so well for. And again, I will turn that over to Warren.
So I actually didn't realize when I was preparing for this that the Zurich 1953 tournament book by Bronstein was one of Svidler's favorite books, and I'm really glad that it is, because it ties in nicely. Because as a prelude to this game with Karjakin, I want to show you a game from that Zurich 53 tournament that Svidler's game instantly brought to mind for me. The idea was so similar. I instantly thought of this game, and I wouldn't be surprised at all if this was his inspiration for that idea. So let's take a quick look. And this was a King's Indian, not a Grunfeld, but if you know anything about openings, that's a close cousin, like the Benoni, to the King's Indian. So they're not all unrelated. And here, Savitar came up with a really, really cool move against Kotov. If you're watching the video, pause it for a few moments and see if you can think of what Gligerich played here.
E4 looks intriguing.
Exactly. So black sacrifices a pawn, but opens up the beast on g7. So really cool idea. And then after it takes f4 to keep white's bishop on d3 blocked out. And now black's going to jump into e5. And black has this wonderful blockade in exchange for the piece. And we're not going to analyze this in detail, but we can just follow the game briefly here. And even in this game, we see black sacrifice a second pawn for the sake of getting the f4 square. It turns out that pawns simply don't really matter in this position. It's more important to have squares active for your pieces. You know, white's extra pawns here in this case really just block his pieces. He'd almost rather not have an e-pawn so that last squared bishop could actually do something. So I think it's a really great example of a blockade. You know, black's pieces are just so beautifully coordinated. You know, white doesn't really have counterplay here. Although both sides kind of just have some improvements they could make, it's fun just to quickly follow this game here. This exchange sacrifice is very cute, by the way. Because this queen threatens b2, the queen can't take. And now black to play knight e2. Because this knight blocks the communication from b2, white has to give back the exchange. But even though white's managed to trade a few pieces, black's domination over the dark square still continues. And although black does have compensation, it's not really more than that, and they ended up drawing here. They agreed to a draw because after this sequence, the repetition is probably the best for both sides. But just a really cool game on the theme of the blockade.
Look at black's bishops.
Yeah, black's position is really just beautiful. Yeah. It's a shame that he can't win this. But But anyway, I think this is a great prelude because I instantly thought of this game when I saw Svidler's game with Karjakin, and I wouldn't be surprised at all if it serves some sort of inspiration for him. So now let's take a look. All right, so this was played at the Amber tournament, by the way, which is a rapid and blindfold event. This game was just rapid, so they had the side of the board, but only 25 minutes. So we see the Grunfeld again. Another exchange variation. This time, Karjakin goes for a knight f3 line, which is another big main line. Of course, the disadvantage of this is that it allows black to undermine the d4 square a little bit more easily. And in this line, tactics are key. So black takes an f3 first, and now rook d8. Black would like to keep options with the knight for now. Now white blocks a d-file. You may think black has to move the knight now, but in fact he just castled. It's a good tactic to remember in the Grunfeld. You can't actually take the knight because of c4. And the pin on the d-file allows black to get back the piece with interest. The white castles. Now queen c7. Black can still leave it there. Of course we can't take the pawn because of knight e5. Attacking bishop and pawn. Now he just defends c5. Still just leaving the knight there because he can. And now is an important moment. Now, what move do you think Svidler played here? Most of white's pawns are on white squares, but right now we control e5 and we don't control f4.
c4?
c4 is a good move, by the way. It's the computer's preference. It doesn't have the imagination that us humans do.
Sorry, Alex.
Take that, John.
But yes, c4 is the computer's preference.
Okay.
f5.
Well, if f5, the downside is that white will play f4 and then e5.
Yeah.
Basically, that's what white's threatening here is f4. So think of it as black. You want to occupy f4 and e5 so that white can't get the pawns rolling. So how do you do that, though?
Pawn?
Yeah, I thought about that.
Yeah, I thought about that too, but I was like,
Bishop
Yeah.
takes,
Bishop
and then
takes.
what?
Yeah, if bishop takes pawn, then knight g6, and then bishop e5 will follow, and we dominate the dark squares.
Oh, you get that much compensation for it.
Yeah, in
Or
this
counterplay.
case, in this case, black's g pawn is not valuable. Or I mean, pawns are valuable if they can be passed, if they control important squares. In this case, the g pawn doesn't give white anything.
You don't worry about like king h1, rook g1?
Oh no.
No?
Yeah. Turns out the opening of the position really favors
I
black
see
here.
it now. The knight has those control of the squares, and the bishop can go there.
Yeah.
The squares.
The blockade is really important here. So pawns don't always have value for you, right? In this case, the pawn on g6 wasn't really doing anything for us. Yeah. So really, really cool sacrifice. And Karjakin actually didn't even take it. He played f4. And Svidler in return didn't take it either. Because he wants to get his knight on g6, and taking on f4 doesn't help with that.
Right.
So he insists that Karjakin take the pawn. And this time he did, but now he's able to open up the f-file too. And so Svidler has this beautiful blockade on the dark squares. So it renders white's pawn mass in the center not very useful, right? Just like in that Kotov Gleekrich game, white's pawns aren't really very useful. They're not passed, and they're not really controlling important squares. And Karjakin finds a really hard time defending here, and it's not an easy position to play for white. Now all of black's pieces are so much more active than a few moves ago. A few other moves ago, the black rooks weren't doing anything. The black knight was going to be about to get pushed back. And now we just have a beautiful position.
And that white's light square bishop is not doing anything.
Yeah, this bishop looks like a joke, right? And now white can't really defend the center because f4 loses the queen
It still
e4.
seems a little bit counterintuitive because what is black's bishop doing? It doesn't seem like it's really doing that much either. You're pushing the.
Yeah, the blockade just prevents your opponent from improving their position. And really in chess, that's a bad sign. If you can't find a good way to improve your position, yeah, that's not good. And here it's really easy to play black, I think, because you just attack the f-pawn, you occupy the dark squares. With white, it's not so clear what you do. And especially for the slice square bishop, it's hard to find a role, right?
Yeah.
Oh.
Nice in-between move. So even though white managed to trade down to an endgame, he's terribly passive here. And then now black's going to have extra pawn. Or 2 extra pawns actually, and Karjakin just gave up the ghost here. Well, I thought this game was just really instructive because of that g5 move. Just a really cool move. It's not the computer's preference, by the way, but I think it's a really nice move on the theme of the blockade. It really limits white's counterplay, which makes playing your game really easy.
I thought the computer couldn't figure that out.
Well, it's not that the computer couldn't figure it out, it's just that it prefers c4. Yeah, going back to the position.
The programming problem?
No?
No, I wonder.
Well,
if that's,
c4 is probably a good move too, by the way. Yeah, it prefers this followed by knight d3,
Which
right?
move is better though? Svidler's move or the computer?
Well, if you believe the computer, probably c4.
But I wonder back to the original point we were making is like does the g5 move give you much more of options because it opens up the position, it allows your rooks to come into play, it allows a lot more moves and more activity for your other pieces. Whereas
I mean, for a human, I think g5 is much easier to play because when your pawns are blockaded, I think it's psychologically difficult to handle.
So which is stronger than the...
I mean, I really like Svidler's g5 move, especially with the psychological effect, right? It's such a beautiful move. It's a great idea.
It also corresponds to his playing style. He likes this dynamic position, and
Right.
the G5 accomplishes that much better.
But there is a barrier there, right? Because I mean, you're putting that you are sacrificing the pawn, and it's like, oh gosh, I'm kind of freeing up a little bit of my wall of pawns in front of my king. I normally would love to have protecting.
Yeah, I think G5 just shows that a lot of us we overvalue pawns sometimes. They don't have an important role. Like as much as we don't want to sack pawns for no reason in this particular position, the G pawn really doesn't help us, right? So it's more important to blockade white's center and then fix it and then attack it, just like Svidler did with doubling rooks in the F file, putting that on H4, and then putting that F pawn. So it's just an important theme worth remembering.
Yep.
Even with the sacrifice of a pawn, or even two, like in that leverage game, it can be worth it. I mean, in a way, it's similar to the idea of a siege, right? You surround something, and then you capture it, right? So that's the idea of the blockade.
Yep.
So this is just an excellent game, and I wouldn't be surprised at all if he also derived inspiration from that leverage game, because when I saw G5, I was instantly reminded of that same game. Because I also love that book as well, like Lucas mentioned. Okay. And the other game is his game with Nakamura. All right. So again, we see another Grunfeld. And this time Nakamura opted for the primary main line with bishop c4 and knight e2. This is really one of the most important battlefields for the Grunfeld. So playing bishop g4 may look like a waste of time, but provoking f3 can be useful for black because it weakens this bishop's position on e3, and that can be important if you ever get a knight to c4. And it also opens up this diagonal against the king, and you'll actually see later that it ends up being relevant. So f3 is not necessarily so useful for white. By the way, you'll notice that black is just letting the pawn hang there on c5. And this is a common theme in the Grunfeld, that black doesn't mind if white takes the pawn on c5 because then white's pawn structure gets damaged. And black just trusts that he'll eventually be able to recoup the pawn. So that's another thing, if you play the Grunfeld, you should get used to. Because losing the c5 pawn is not the end of the world. And here it's already an important decision for Naka to make. He took on c5, which is okay, but I don't really like it personally. I'm surprised that Nakamura didn't pursue just f5 with trying to attack on the king side. I think it's a more natural idea for white here, especially since he played f4. But he opted for taking on c5, and this is okay, but it really gets rid of a lot of white's dynamic possibilities. I mean, I think black's really the one in the driver's seat now. Even though the computer will tell you, of course, white's doing fine. But white's pawn structure is just kind of ugly, so that's the reason I don't really like it so much. I think it's a little bit unintuitive for a human. And here Nakamura kind of miscalculates, I think. So, the computer's preference is just queen f2, aiming for attack on f7. And then after, maybe move the knight to defend that c5 pawn. But I think Nakamura miscalculated here. He thought that... so he has a nice sequence here where he can win the exchange. So knight e2 threatens the rook, and we're also threatening bishop b6. But like I said, I think Nakamura miscalculated here. So rook back, black takes. Now he attacks his bishop. And it's a little bit awkward, if you play bishop here, then rook d2 is a problem for us. So rook f3, but now f5, threatening a simple fork on e4. So he defends it, but now bishop f8. I think he missed this move. And this is what I was talking about with the f-pawn earlier, the fact that this diagonal is open, and it causes white some issues. Unfortunately, this rook doesn't really have any good squares to go to, right? We retreat, then black simply forks us on e4.
What about rook d4?
Well, that's what he did, but then we get pinned.
Oh.
Exchange that one.
So black has this really beautiful crossfire with bishops. If you ever doubt that two bishops are powerful, this is a good example of their usage.
Would it help to maybe the king over h1 he moves back to avoid that then?
On the previous move?
I don't know if you can
Well,
spray
maybe if
it.
he moves back.
He never had time, really.
Yeah, you can't spend
The bishop's
time.
under threat, and now the pawn's under threat, and now the rook's under threat. White really had no time to breathe. But yeah, unfortunately, now after the rook pin, black's going to win material. Yeah, rook e8's another nice move. There's no rush to take on d4 because the rook can't move anyway. So he might as well just pile on this pawn on e4.
So clever.
And pile on a2, which white can't defend, by the way. And there's a nice tactical sequence here. Rook takes.
Yeah. Check.
Now you look awkward because the rook's under attack and the bishop. But black can solve this problem. Black to play and win.
Seems like
Yeah, it looks scary.
bishop b3 holds on to everything.
Yeah. So just a counterattack on white's rook.
Yeah, and if you trade, black has the one endgame, 2 pawns out.
Exactly. By the way, rook d5 doesn't work because after rook takes bishop, the bishop can't be taken because the knight's still hanging.
Yeah.
So yeah, bishop b3. White has nothing good here. So he went to the endgame, but black has 2 extra pawns, so it's just a matter of technique at this point.
Yep.
Nakamura was probably just playing by inertia. Even though white won both the queenside pawns, now the king is offside.
Yeah.
Black can just push that pawn home.
Right.
So Nakamura finally just resigned here. But just a really nice game. Again, we see Svidler basically out-calculating his opponents. We saw it earlier with Kasparov, and here we see it with Nakamura. So he did really well in these sharp positions, especially the Grunfeld. So any questions about this one? Yeah, but I think it's really cool in that game against Karjakin. I think it's just really, really instructive in the theme of the blockade.
Incidentally, it may surprise you to know that Warren said that Svidler's won a couple of games here by outcalculating his opponents. Svidler is notorious for his movement while playing. When we picture chess players, we often picture them hunched over the chessboard and, Nakamura with his hands to the side of his eyes like he's looking at the board with blinders. Svidler is known for just getting up, moving around, looking at other games, and he's still thinking about his game while he's moving, but he's up and moving a lot, in his games. He's very expressive, he's very, animated, and he is, I wouldn't say constantly in motion, that would be an exaggeration, but he's certainly more mobile than many players. And yet, he seems to be extremely strong at calculation, despite not staring at the board. I picture Kasparov staring at the board intently and with all the calculations running through his brain. Svidler seems to do much the same thing while he's wandering about. So more recently, Svidler played in the World Chess Championship in 2007. This was a round robin. He finished 5th, so not entirely close. Perhaps the greatest accomplishment of his chess career, I don't know if you'd put it above winning the World Russian Championship 7 times, but he won the World Cup in 2011 over some very good competition, beating Pogar in the quarterfinals, then Ponomaryov, who had that was kind of payback for the World Chess Championship in 2002, and then beating Grishuk in the final to win the World Cup in 2011. That was a very big win in a format that's very challenging. And because of his win there, he was seeded into the candidate cycle of 2012-2013. And he placed 3rd, half a point behind Carlsen, who ended up becoming the challenger to face Vishwanathan Anand in the World Chess Championship, and he won that tournament, or he won that match. But Svidler was 3rd, so again, very, very close. He was half a point back from being able to contest against Vishwanathan Anand. That said, he probably would have lost to Anand, and I'll get to that in a moment. 2014, I told you he got the organizer's bid. He did not do as well in 2014. Finished 7th, next to last against some really strong competition. So Anand won the right to challenge Carlsen for the World Chess Championship. That occurred in Sochi, and as we know, Carlsen won that match, but not by the same margin that he won the year previously. So he now enters this year's candidate cycle Going against, we know who he's going against. We know he's going against Anand, Nakamura, Karjakin. We assume he's going to go against Giri and Topalov. We know he's going to go against Caruana. And I've listed his records, wins, losses, and draws. Now, Svidler calls Anand Vlad. That's his nickname for Anand. He calls him Vlad, after Vlad the Impaler, because Anand has had his number. You see, he's never beaten Anand in classical chess. 0 wins, 6 losses, 22 draws. And so he jokingly calls him Vlad. And that's why when I was saying earlier that if he would have been matched up against Anand, I wouldn't have liked his chances. So he's going to be facing Anand, against whom he has a not so ideal record. Against Naka, who he has a very good record against. Karjakin, he's shown that in the World Chess Cup that he and Karjakin are pretty equal right now. So even though Karjakin has the edge overall, I wouldn't necessarily count Svidler out in that. He has a favorable record against Giri, though they haven't played a lot. Caruana's done pretty well against him, and Topalov's done pretty well against him. But he does have a winning record against Magnus Carlsen. There is only one other player listed here that has a plus record against Carlsen. Do you know who it is? Warren?
Caruana?
Nope. Anish Giri. I seem to recall that only Giri had a positive record against Carlsen, but again, the sample size was quite low. They haven't played a lot. So it looks like Svidler is going to have a tough candidates tournament again. We've talked in the past in the run-up here, and Warren has said that for him, Anand is the favorite, and we've also talked in the Nakamura lecture about how good of a year Nakamura's had. I said in my Nakamura lecture that he hadn't won any major tournaments. I was incorrect in that. Nakamura's won several tournaments, as some people wisely pointed out, including the U.S. Championship and including now the Millionaire Chess Championship. So Nakamura's probably had the best year of any chess player, at least to this point. So it is going to be a pretty tough tournament for Svidler. I'm not sure, how good his chances are, but as with anything Svidler, it really depends on the preparation that he puts in going into it. It depends on his mindset and training in the lead up to that. Now, Svidler has a pretty busy life. In addition to, being a rabid cricket fan and playing billiards and, talking about the allure of books and computer games and this, that, and the other, he has a family. So he has a wife. Her name is Olga. They married, almost 15 years ago now, I think. And he has 2 sons, twin boys, who are about age 12. You see him pictured below, shaking hands with Anand, and Anand's wife is there. So you see that he has a family, and that keeps him very busy. They live in St. Petersburg. Svidler does quite a bit of work, in the chess community. I've mentioned his commentary. I've mentioned, all of his interests. So he has to balance all of these things. And he talks quite frankly in an interview about the fact that when he first got married, his rating took a hit, that the time he was spending on chess took a hit, but actually it's benefited from it in the long term. And I think a lot of chess players would make that same point, that at first you have a feeling out period where you're trying to balance family life and your career, but that eventually, the advantages exceed that and you perform better as a result. There are certainly several other candidates who are married. We've mentioned Anand. We've mentioned Nakamura in a long-term relationship. Giri, I believe, is married as well already. So there are quite a few of the candidates who are in those sorts of relationships, and it works just fine for them. But Svidler certainly had a little adaptation period there. We've got one more game to go over tonight. I know it's been quite a few, but this one is quite special because it's Carlsen versus Svidler. This is in the candidates tournament in 2013. And if you remember, this was a very exciting candidates tournament. It actually went down to the final round, and there was a lot riding, or seemingly riding, on this game as to who was going to be the candidate facing Anand. And it was very, very close going into that, and we'll see that this match, it was thought, was going to have an impact on it, but some weird things happens in the last round. Also, we're deviating from the Grunfeld here. We're going to look at the Ruy Lopez, the Spanish game. When asked, Svidler said that the Ruy Lopez was his fort, that it is his strong suit, that he knows the Ruy Lopez very well on both sides of it. We also know that Carlsen knows the Ruy Lopez very well and has played it a lot, particularly against Anand. So it'll be interesting to see how two experts on this opening system, how their game shapes up. So for our final game, I'll turn it back over to Warren.
So in the tournament situation, to elaborate a little bit further, so both Carlsen and Kramnik had the same number of points going into the last round. They had 8 points, but Carlsen had the better tie breaks. So for Kramnik, this meant that Kramnik was playing black against Ivanchuk, and he had to win in order to basically have a real shot at winning the candidates, because if Kramnik drew and Carlsen drew with white, which wasn't, unlikely, then that means that Carlsen would have won because of the superior tie breaks. So Kramnik was playing for a win. But for Carlsen, that means that he also must win, because if Carlsen draws, Kramnik finishes ahead, and 9 versus 8.5, Kramnik wins the candidates and plays it on. So in a weird situation, both were playing for a win in intense situations. So let's take a look. So that's just the context for the game. And you could say that, maybe Carlsen's loss was caused by his pushing for a win, but he still Carlsen played good chess, and he didn't really play recklessly, as you'll see.
It's worth noting the rating difference here.
yeah, more than 100 points, well over 100 points. Yeah, I think Carlsen's highest rating was achieved in either 2013 or 14. Something like 28...
81, 83, something like that.
Yeah, something...
I broke 2900 at one point.
No.
He hasn't reached rating, yes, but...
Yeah, he's ridiculous. Yeah, actually, Carlsen has had a performance rating over 3,000 in Nanjing, China. But that was surpassed by... Anyone know?
Caruana.
Yeah, Caruana and the Siegefeld over 3,100, I think.
Yeah, I think Pablo Ulyanov's World Cup performance was up there, too.
Yeah, Ulyanov also...
I think it broke 3,000.
Yeah. So we've seen some very impressive performances recently. At least performance rating. I guess you could argue rating inflation might contribute to that a little bit.
Right.
Okay. Well, let's get into this game. So Carlsen plays slightly offbeat, which is d3 line, which, by the way, is also a favorite of Svidler's. He likes to play d3 in this position. But is a little bit offbeat. Of course, rook e1 is the big main line for the Ruy Lopez. If you look it up in ChessBase, this has by far the most number of moves there. But d3. Of course, after d3, by the way, white's threatening to take on c6, because if black just castles, white's going to win a pawn for free, since e4 is now well shored up. So that's why black has to play b5 here. And now black kind of makes a threat of his own, because if white just plays something like h3, then white loses the bishop on b3. I say loses, it gets exchanged, right? And of course, we don't want that. So a3 preserves it. Now knight c3, another kind of offbeat idea. So, again, typically in the Ruy, you're going to see white playing a c3 idea. But since white's played a3, it might look kind of funky, because playing both a3 and c3 is kind of redundant. Typically if white's going to play c3, he would do it here, since that also gives the bishop a square on c2 to tuck away from the knight. So a3 and knight c3 kind of go together. Now bishop b7. Now queen d7. Now this move may look kind of funky, but it does some important things. It connects the black rooks, so it helps along with the development, and it also gives a useful square on d8 for the knight, which black will use to reroute to e6. And in king pawn openings, it's often useful. You oftentimes see a knight rerouted, for white to e3 or g3, so it can go to f5 or d5. And the same strategy applies for black too. Oftentimes jumping to f4 or d4 can be useful. So that's why the knight's going to e6. So already both sides are kind of migrating their knights over to those squares. Black wants to preserve his bishops too. And already I think Svidler has achieved a pretty nice position. He has one big pawn island and no real weaknesses. It's basically a nice position where you can slowly improve your pieces. For Carlsen, of course, this is not a good position. If you really have to win. But he does have some resources, and he's able to complicate matters here. And here I think Svidler makes a mistake. I don't really like this g6 move. I think it creates weaknesses in the dark squares. I think a better idea would have been just knight f6 going back and being patient. I think g6 is a little bit too ambitious. It's not pleasant tolerating a knight on f5 because it's so dangerous having the next to your king. But in this case, I think it's worth it to not weaken your king. Now knight g5. The attack on f7 is surprisingly kind of annoying to meet, so he just elects to try to block it. And this is already a chance for Carlsen, if he wanted to try to simplify things. It was probably better to take on d5 and then bring the knight back. And maybe white has a slight edge here because of these weaknesses on h6 and f6. But I guess he wanted something sharper because the queen is still a little bit passive on c1. So he liked to try to keep more pieces on the board. By the way, the point is that if you take the knight, then white gets the two bishops with that. But the problem is that white's king is also weak in this position. Because white also has these complex of light squares weak around the king. So it's really double-edged. Of course, the point here is that if you take the bishop and queen h6, then we're going to get mated. So this is not good. So king g8. So it's a really dicey situation. And he played queen e3, which is okay. But the computer also likes this funky move, bishop h8. Hardly a human idea because not many people want to put their pieces in the corner. But apparently this was its preference. I guess one of the ideas would be rook e7. And now white can obtain a material advantage by taking. And I guess the computer slightly prefers white here. But I don't blame Carlsen for not playing that. It's not a very human solution. And now Carlsen kind of misses a nice tactic. I don't blame him for it. It's not obvious. He plays f3, and that basically gives Svidler a winning position.
What's wrong with queen takes c5 check?
Well, if queen takes c5 check, I think, what's the move? King g7. And the problem is that the threat on g2 is actually hard to meet. And this knight's also under attack, so yeah. I think white's basically losing material there. But based on that idea, he has a nice move here. He could have played this bishop d5 move. Really cute. The idea is that if you take the bishop, then we check, and then pick it up. He missed this idea. Really cute. It's hard to blame him for it. I mean, that's a pretty slick tactic. But this was basically the only move that can save him at this point.
I bet Anand would have found that.
Alright, but instead he played f3, but now Svidler has a really good position. Knight f4. Threatening mate on g2. And the problem, white basically has to take, but the problem is that he loses his bishop, and his king is open, and he's got a lot of hanging pieces. He really can't defend adequately here. The queen doesn't really defend f3 because it's too busy defending the rook on e1, but now white's king is really drafty. And now black has the winning endgame. This f-pawn is really hard to stop. The two bishops just beautifully shepherd that f-pawn. It looks like a piece sacrifice, but white can't really take it because now black just queens by force. So really nice cleanup. Carlsen did have chances, but they were by no means obvious moves as we saw. And Svidler really handled this really very nicely. So any questions on this one? Yeah, I mean, I don't know if we've looked at any people so far who have a plus record against Carlsen, so it can't necessarily discount Svidler.
Well, if you've enjoyed Peter Svidler, and if I've convinced you to give his videos a look because you're interested in his chess knowledge or in his personality, I'd recommend on YouTube, there's a series sponsored by Chess24 called Banter Blitz, where you have Peter Svidler and lots of other players playing blitz sessions for about an hour, hour and a half, sometimes 2 hours. And here he was playing 3-minute games against premium members of Chess24, and he was doing commentary as he played. And actually, for the final game of this session, he got paired against Lawrence Trent. That was probably planned. Lawrence Trent is an IM and is managing Fabiano Caruana, you may remember from the lecture, and he's also a commentator for various outlets like Chess24. And there was this position where Svidler is playing a white, and he makes this knight move, and he says, "No, Lawrence, this is not how chess works," because he was basically thinking that he had this game won. Turns out that Black was able to add lots of interesting complications by advancing that c-pawn, and this ended up in Svidler losing because he got flagged. So it's but the point is it's very entertaining. When he gets loosened up, he's very amusing in how he comments. He'll say, "Oh, I'm going to play h4 and then mate him," and then he'll play h4, and then 15 moves later he'll mate him, and he says, "See, play h4, you mate him," and so he's very humorous when he's talking. And Warren's made the case for the fact that Svidler is very, very adept at the Grunfeld. I'd like to say that he's written the book on the Grunfeld, but Svidler may be a little bit too lazy to actually write a book. But what he has done is he has recorded a video series for Chess24, and you do have to pay to access it, but it is a overview of the Grunfeld. And when I say overview, it's actually several hours, like 12 hours of commentary with various systems in the Grunfeld. So if you are trying to become one of the world's or trying to know what the world's foremost expert on the Grunfeld knows, it's certainly worth your time. And this is geared more to like the 2,000, 2,200 player, perhaps even higher rated than that, because it gets very highly theoretical. It gets very, very deep into this opening and explores all sorts of different lines with it. But Svidler's actually put it out there, and now his opponents are able to watch it and kind of prep for him. So I don't know, how he feels about that in the grand scheme of things. And he's currently working on a similar sort of system or similar sort of series for the Ruy Lopez. I think we've established with this game against Carlsen that he knows the Spanish game very well, and he's working for a similar series for the Ruy Lopez. And then he also has a video series out on reviewing some of the games of Tal, who's his hero, and I know Tal's our most popular video on YouTube, so I'm sure there are a lot of people who would be interested in that as well. As always, I'll go over our sources. We use primarily, sorry, I had to change the background color so that you could see those links somewhat clearer. I used exclusively interviews. Svidler has written a lot and he's said a lot about his opinions about various things, and all the quotes that I've integrated into this lecture have come from various interviews done over the past really eight years or so. And he has provided very lengthy explanations, everything from his preferences with British humor — he's a big fan of Monty Python and Fawlty Towers, for example — to his view on his own training and his own work ethic, to family life, to cricket, to the current state of chess. Very wide-ranging opinions, and he's very in-depth with that. So if you're interested, you can certainly check those out. They are multi-parters because they are quite lengthy. And as I take any questions that you might have, I'm going to leave you with Svidler. One of the questions that he was asked is, what's the best move you've ever made on the chessboard? And Svidler pointed out the move, not the move displayed here, but the subsequent move. White has just played Queen F3, and it's Black to move. And I'll give you a chance to think about this and see what Svidler might have come up with. I'll tell you at the end. But in the meantime, do you have any questions about Svidler or the series, where we're going from here?
What's next?
Next is Karjakin, and we're going to do that lecture in about a month. That lecture will likely be on a Thursday. So check the Center 64 calendar. and we'll cover Karjakin. And then the following month will probably be Topalov, and then followed up, I presume, with Geary, who should get in by rating. Then we'll cover the organizer's nominee, and that'll take us all the way through the end of February, with the candidates tournament beginning in March, and that will be lots of fun to watch. I should also mention one thing that's looming kind of far down the road, but is pretty fascinating, is through the YouTube channel, I was contacted by the official photographer for a tournament or a match called USSR versus the World #2. This was in the early 80s, and it was contested in England, and it had the best players from the Soviet Union, Kasparov, Karpov, etc., and the best players from the world, which actually included Korchnoi and Timin and a couple of other famous Western players. And he was the official match photographer, and he reached out and said, if you'd like to, I would be glad to send you some of my photographs for that lecture. So I'm collaborating with him, and that we're looking at having sometime in the spring, and it should be pretty awesome because many of these photographs have never been seen outside of, or they're not online anywhere. You can't see them anywhere. There's no real write-up that features them. So it will be some pretty new content that I'm pretty excited about. So that's what's looming in the immediate future and kind of in the more distant future. While I've been talking, does anybody have a theory about the move that was played here?
RAC8.
Rook A to C8. No, that's not what he played. I'm not savvy enough to tell you why. Renee, you think a pawn move?
Yeah, pawn move and put it up front. Pawn move, pawn move.
You're thinking like the B pawn or something? Like B3?
How about H6?
H6 is exactly what he played.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, H6 with an exclam.
The idea is F5, so GH6, F5.
Yeah, and this is the move that he's proudest of. This was in, as you can see, the 2005 FIDE World Championship against Michael Adams, and this match was drawn. But he was subjected to a pretty strong kingside attack. And I learned, when your king's under threat and your opponent's advancing pawns, you should leave your pawns immobile. And I also, and that by moving pawns, you create weaknesses. And here, if you play H6, it's immediately taken. So it seems extremely counterintuitive, at least for someone of my chess acumen. But Warren sees and correctly identifies H6. That's just correct. Very good. Other questions or comments?
What happens after H6?
After H6, G takes H6.
I noticed that they drew. That's interesting.
Yeah, he drew. I actually have the continuation for you if you're interested. You could follow it a lot quicker than I can.
The pawn? That's a bad move.
Yeah, plays H6, and his G takes H6. Well, yeah, but then you get an open file directly opposite the king. That seems very attractive.
So like Black has a nice position. I guess he must have made a mistake later on.
Yeah. Anyway, I thought that of all the games, and we've seen a lot of really strong games by Svidler tonight, he picked one that was in a drawing match, or drawing game, but this is the move he was proudest of, this H6 move. Of all the clever moves he's made, this is the seemingly innocuous decision that he chose, but interesting nonetheless.